Nobody in Fort Dodge had ever heard of Variety or knew where to get it, but I finally found out who published it. And I wrote in, and so every week I went in to see the guy that ran the pool hall, who had a magazine section, and he brought in Variety. I paid him the 15 cents. And I became what you might call a closet Variety reader with a desire to get into pictures. Now, I knew damn well I wasn't an actor or a writer or a director, but I had been sort of aiming at the law, so I figured I would get a law degree and get in the picture business. This era was a very important era. It was the beginnings of the television era. But you couple that then with the fact that the consent decree, there had been for some 10 years an action brought by independent theater owners who had been getting the shaft from the big motion picture companies. Most of them had theaters, and they would put their pictures, of course, in their own theaters. And that was not illegal. The independent theater owners were not getting their pick or even any first run, second run, third run, or fourth run, or whatever it was. It took 10 years, but finally the Supreme Court held that that was antitrust. And it forced the major companies to split their production and their exhibition. In 1950, there were 20,000 hardtop theaters. There were no multiples. There were a handful of drive-ins, you see. By 1960, 1/3 of the hardtop theaters had closed their doors because of these various problems we talked about. So at that particular time, I and a chap I had met, Jim Nicholson, decided that this was a field at the very time when everybody was saying motion pictures are something to get out of because television is going to take over. We thought to ourselves, this is the time now for us to go into the motion picture field. There were a great mass building of tract homes. So what you did is you had people moving out into the boondocks and bringing up their kids. And they were going to sit at home with their kids and watch television, which meant that they were no longer going to the movies. So who was going to the movies? The young people, the teenagers and the unmarried 20s. I had a 35mm operation at home, and I was getting pictures from the other companies because of certain friendships I had. So we used to bring in 40, 50 kids. I shouldn't say we, but my nephews and nieces, and later on my own kids when they got into the teens. And we got, it was a great way to discover what they liked. Teenagers were having a fight with their parents and with older authorities over the music, for one thing. I mean, the Beatles came along and Elvis Presley. And when Elvis Presley scratched his balls, lots of people objected. Apparently, the young people didn't object, you see. So what we had is we had a differentiation there. Now, also along came a different kind of dancing. Now, they would complain about that. In fact, in several of our pictures, we even had the local parents and authorities, you know, not wanting to let a rock concert or the kids rock. Well, see, that also happened in many communities. There was this differentiation, this distinction, this fighting. But you see what had happened in the meantime now is that because the teenagers were the only, not the only ones, but the ones who went mostly to the cinemas, and because they were the ones who were buying most of the sheet music and most of the records, we began to have a teenage market that was substantial. But you see, the older people didn't like it. I mean, that has continued to some degree even up till today. But for the most part, the teenagers are that important. And we realized another thing that the majors didn't. They still had old-timers, people who had been built up as stars. Take, for example, Joan Crawford. See? Now, Joan Crawford must have started at about 25. And she generally played a sort of a daring young person, a dance hall girl, a waitress, whatever, you see. And what's more, since the public had seen her since she was 25, the general public, the fact that she was now 45 or 47 or 48 didn't bother them any. See? But when I had these groups sitting there in my house, and I would hear comments like, "My God, she's older than my mother." Now you can see what that means. That means that this audience, which is basically now the biggest audience, the teenagers in the unmarried 20s, doesn't want, when they want to see pictures about themselves, and they're teenagers or in their 20s, they want subjects that interest them, and they want people that they deem pertinent to those subjects. Jim Nicholson had been in the theater business for a long time. He started as an usher. He gradually worked his way up. I think he was a projectionist for a while. He became a manager of a few small theaters, which probably meant he was a cinematographer, projectionist, and this and that, and so on and so forth. And he then ultimately leased 4 theaters in Los Angeles. And he played old pictures. But he would repackage them and put new titles on them in many cases. Of course, you had to put the old titles on in small print, because otherwise the Federal Commerce Commission would accuse you of illegalities. So it was Jim's duty to take these old pictures, put 2 of them together. That was the secret. Not do as the majors did, which is to have one picture about whatever it was, and a second picture completely different, on the concept that you'd have something for everybody, which really isn't the best way. The best way, since everybody doesn't go to see every movie anyway, is to take 2 pictures of the same kind, appealing to the same audience, and put them together, which later on became part of the secret of what we were doing. The trouble with the second feature is, the first feature gets a percentage, the second feature gets a flat price, and if you have to depend on that flat price, you're dead. You can never build a company. You're lucky if you can even get by, you see. So we knew we couldn't do that, and here we were being, even though our picture might have dragged the people in because it was about a teenager, they were putting the major company, because the major company had a lot of heft. If you don't play my picture, you know, if you insist on playing AIP's picture and not mine, I won't sell you my others. So what we had to do in a form of desperation was to make 2 teenage pictures and sell it for 1 percentage price, but percentage. So we got to talking about these things, and then of course I was running these pictures and getting these kids in, and I finally said to Jim one day, I said, "Jim, I think there's a market." I said, "But we can't just make second features. We have to make features that will stand on their own, features that are exploitable." Now, exploitation didn't used to be a bad word. When the circus parade came down the streets of Fort Dodge, Iowa, that was exploitation, but there wasn't anything evil about it. I mean, when you even take a big star now and run him all around the country, that's exploitation. But nobody says that's exploitation. But if I make a picture, you know, that's a little bit lurid, people say, "Oh, Arkoff, he's back at those exploitation pictures." I don't happen to consider it an evil word, but if they don't want to countenance it, as long as the public does, to hell with it. And so we put these 2 pictures, Day the World Ended and Phantom from 10,000 Leagues. 2 sci-fi pictures, each costing approximately, I don't know, $80,000, $90,000, $100,000. See, made in 2 weeks each. And they wouldn't buy them. The major company says, "You buy them, you don't get my pictures." The exhibitor said to us, "Look, you're doing all right with those second features," like hell we were. "We can't do this." Well, we just hung out. For 3 months, we didn't get a date. I thought that was about the end of AIP. And finally, we got a date in Detroit, at the Fox Detroit, a gigantic 5,000-seat theater. that by this time, because of all the problems, they've closed off the whole balcony. It used to be said that there were more sex play in the balcony of the Fox Theater than ever showed up on the screen. And it was also said that you could hunt deer in the balcony. I don't know if these things are absolutely true, but you know how it goes. So we have this date, but how the hell are we going to advertise the picture? There's no advertising by TV yet. There's no newspapers because newspapers are on strike. So what we did is that we hired 2 flatbed trucks. And on one we put a tableau of the Phantom from 10,000 Leagues. And so we had the Phantom, you know, dressed in a sinister way. And he was on this flatbed, of course, and he was advancing on this girl who was dressed in some very light and eye-filling garb. And in back of her, advancing to protect her, and she, of course, was in shrieking terror, in back of her, advancing to protect her, were 2 guys wearing not very much either. The other one, The Day the World Ended, had the 3-eyed monster, which we had in that picture, see? Doing the same thing, more or less. So we ran those 2 flatbed trucks through the streets of Detroit in early December. It was sleeting, it was snowing, it was icy, it was cold. But we got coverage from the television stations, news coverage. They all came out to see it, and it was a success. And so now we were off and running. We never went more than about 50% drive-ins and 50% hardtop, but the drive-ins in season. See, the major companies didn't even think much of the summer. I have to tell you that the major companies are so fornicatingly stupid and continue to be in these gigantic prices that they keep paying to actors and directors and keep increasing. You know, they always are going to be in trouble. But it happens to be a very profitable business, basically. You see, it's the difference between, let's say, the horse. The horse and buggy, at one time, was one of the methods of transportation. When the car came along, the horse and buggy became archaic. But you see, that hasn't happened in the motion picture business. What's happened is that it's changed, it's increased. I mean, you have all these ancillaries. It's true that some of the items like theaters may be a little less, but the public still wants to see film and tape and so on and so forth. So the companies can afford to be this stupid because they have power. And even though most people think that the exhibitors and the distributors are at each other's throat, that used to be true, but it's like the throat of brothers, you know, like family arguments. But when it comes down to Tukasaf and Tish, which is a Jewish expression for put your ass on the table time, yes, they are together. It's just a coincidence that Jim drove the white car and I drove the black car for many years, see? Just a coincidence, because I remember one time he started to gain weight as he got older, and for a moment in time, and I went on a very odd diet of gruel, sort of vegetable gruel, smelled terribly. But for 2.5 months, I took this gruel 3 times a day, and I used to even bring it to the office and cook it there, and everybody, you know, would go around with their noses. But I lost 65 pounds. So for a moment in time, I weighed less than Jim did. See? So I got up at a NATO convention, and I said, I have an announcement to make. I said, I now weigh less than Jim. I'm going to buy the white car, and he's going to have the black car. I'm going to have access to all the beautiful ladies, and he's going to have to take the problems, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, about 2 weeks later, the weights reversed themselves, and nothing ever changed. Jim Nicholson was a great title man. Jim Nicholson never drank in the daytime, but would have a little booze at night. And he'd come in the next morning with some titles. And I can remember the day he came in with the title, The Beast with a Million Eyes. Absolutely natural title. I remember the day he came in with the title, I Was a Teenage Werewolf. I mean, these are great titles. You could recognize them. I would say to Jim, you've come in with $1 million title for a $100,000 picture. So we would start with the title, and then we would make up some rough artwork. We were really doing things back-assward. And people used to kind of joke about that, you know, because they always started doing a script. And if the script didn't look too good, but looked like a good subject, they'd do another script. And they could have $1 million in the picture. They'd do it, and then they come in after they make the picture that nobody asked the sales department about, and they'd say, sell it. And what would happen in most of the companies is the head of sales would say to the next guy in sales, in a whisper, to whom? You got to make merchandise for a public that's there. See? So that's why we would get the title, and then we would send out our emissaries. We had high school kids to go out and talk to high school kids, and they'd have a list of titles and a list of stories. And then we had college kids do the same with college kids. In 1958, we made 22 pictures, 11 combinations, plus we picked up a few more. We were running about 25, 26 pictures a year that we distributed. And we saw what was happening because there were just too many pictures out of that type. And the majors were already beginning to learn that the summer was a good time. You know, it finally drilled in. Now, we figured by this time that we were better off to put the money we put into 2 pictures into 1 picture and play an older picture if we needed a second feature. And we didn't, as time went along, you didn't need a second feature as much. You did in the drive-ins, but you didn't in the hardtops. We made 13 Poe pictures, but a number of them at the last weren't even Poes. And the reason was because the Poe pictures in the main were based on stories that were maybe 4, 5, 6 pages long. I think the only book or bigger story that Poe wrote was The Gold Bug. There may have been something bigger than that, but most of them were short. Like The Pit and the Pendulum was only like the end. You had to fill in all the rest of it. So we needed to have pictures. I suppose you'd call them sequels today. But when you had a successful picture like the first Poe picture, you knew you could make some more. You didn't know how many. We did 13 beach party pictures. We did maybe about that many motorcycle pictures. So whenever we could get something that was successful, we knew that we could continue, because what would happen is that your cost would be here and your gross or profit would be here. Now your cost would continue to go up and your gross generally, although on the Poe picture it was about the second or third, but generally would go down, at least maybe you go this way. And ultimately when they crossed, we said enough.
Were you surprised when they, with the Museum of Modern Art tribute to American International Pictures?
Yeah, because we never thought about it. As I said on the evening, you know, I said we never made these pictures for museums. That was true. We made them for the public. Because in the early days, we used to get shafted from everybody. You know, most of the commentators in those days, that's before you had these evening shows where they talk about movies that are aimed to a great extent at young people, see. Before that, the people who talked about movies were old sour apples. When we made I Was a Teenage Werewolf, we got a whole group of the ads back from Senator Douglas's, I guess it was one of his henchmen, you know, complaining about this thing we were doing, you know, to the public. And so I wrote back to Senator Douglas and I said, look, I am convinced that you haven't seen this picture. I said, you shouldn't make comments or even have emissaries that make comments unless you know what you're talking about. Now, I'm going to set up a screening for you in Washington. I'm going to send you a list of dates, and it'll be available for you. Just let me know which date you want. And then if you don't like it, then I will sit down and talk seriously with you. You know it never happened. Never happened. Okay? We often got credit for starting things. I don't know that we ever started them, but we were in there fast. You see, it was a very interesting group that we had, because on the one hand, we started Woody Allen. But you know, the interesting thing about that picture is that that picture did not sell, only in the colleges. It was too advanced. Public wasn't ready to accept any departures from Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Standard, Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. So it wasn't until he did his second or third picture that they began, and of course we never took a picture out of exhibition. We kept playing it, and we cannibalized the prints as the prints got older, you know. So we were right there with him. Francis Coppola did his first picture for us. He'd worked for us in a number of capacities, you know, before that, and for Roger and for us. And we did Dementia 13 with him in Ireland. We had Scorsese, first picture. He went to NYU, and Scorsese was born in the Italian district in New York. I don't remember the exact area, but it was the same area. There were a lot of gangsters. Not that Scorsese or his family were ever involved in any way. But he went to NYU. He was accustomed to what went on in New York. I don't think he'd ever been west of the Hudson. But I saw some parts of the student film he did, which later on became Mean Street. Because I used to go around lecturing, you know, at these film classes and so on and so forth. And in the meantime, taking a look at, you know, who were the likely people who had done student films or whatever. And so we did Boxcar Bertha, which was a story about a girl, actual story, who got into trouble with the police and had to escape across country by taking boxcars. We had, what's her name in this picture?
Barbara Hershey.
Barbara Hershey, with her then lover, one of his father, he comes from...
Yeah, David Carradine.
Yeah, David Carradine. Thank God when I go on these speaking tours, I can never remember all these 500 titles, and there's always some buff in the audience who can supply me with a missing name.
Could there be an AIP today?
Oh, sure. There always is room for an AIP or what have you. It changes. There's always room. There's always room for the right-thinking independent. And I'll tell you why. Because, fundamentally, it isn't as though money alone controls it. Money does control a lot. Money can buy a lot. But in the picture business, there's always somebody. It's the independents who bring in the ideas, even though they become major pictures. You have to have guts, you have to have balls, you have to have luck. You have to meet people well, because who knows where you'll get that script that's good.
Mm-hmm. You left talent out of that.
Yeah, no, I left talent out of it. You have to have talent. I met Ed Wood. I met him through Alex Gordon. And I'll never forget the day when I come back to my office and my secretary says, the lady won't tell me her name. I said, does she have an appointment? And my secretary says, no, not as far as I know. I don't know what her name is. She's waiting for you. And I thought, Jesus Christ, what have I done now? Anyway, I walk in, and then the woman starts talking. And we talk for maybe 15 or 20 minutes. And I realize it's Ed Wood, dressed as a woman. I got to tell you, this is a great game. You know, where could I get such amusement in anything else?